Defiance today from a lifelong public servant and former director of the FBI turned criminal defendant whose very case symbolizes the perversion of the rule of law in America under Donald Trump. Former FBI Director Jim Comey pleaded not guilty in court today to 2 criminal counts, one for lying to Congress, the other for obstruction. The judge scheduling his trial expected to last 2 to 3 days for January 5th, 2026. But before that happened, Comey's attorney says expect a flurry of motions. Comey's lawyers saying that he plans to challenge every aspect of this case. They even plan to challenge the appointment of acting U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan. She was put in place by Donald Trump after her predecessor, the previous acting U.S. Attorney Eric Siebert, refused to bring a criminal case against Jim Comey and against New York Attorney General Tish James. New York Times reporting this, quote, "The issue is that when there is a vacancy in the position, the Attorney General is able to install someone as an interim U.S. attorney for 120 days. But after that expires, the law says a federal court can decide who next serves as interim. If the indictment is thrown out on the grounds that Halligan is not a valid U.S. attorney, it is hard to see how the case could be revived." Her appointment is central to the other argument that Comey's legal team intends to make, that his prosecution is a case of malicious and selective prosecution by the Trump administration. Donald Trump's push to prosecute Jim Comey didn't take place behind closed doors or over texts or signal messages or hushed private conversations. It was done in public. It was out there for everyone to see. On September 20th, Donald Trump posted this, quote, "What about Comey? Adam Shifty Schiff, Letitia, 3 question marks. They're all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done," end quote. Then Trump said he fired the prosecutor who refused to bring the case against Jim Comey. Then he suggested a new U.S. attorney, his former personal attorney, Lindsay Halligan. She was sworn in 2 days later. Halligan then had to present the case against Comey on her own. No one reportedly went with her. Halligan is now bringing in assistant U.S. attorneys from other offices to help her prosecute the case against Jim Comey. New York Times reports that Comey's attorney, Patrick Fitzgerald, told the court that they have very few details still about what the case is. Quote, "We still have not been told who person 3 and person 1 are," he said, referring to the indictment. He later added, quote, "We still haven't been told precisely what is in count 1 or count 2, end quote. But Trump's public and furious push for an indictment may be the set of facts that matters most to what happens next. The arraignment of former FBI Director Jim Comey marking the start of a hugely significant turn for our country, as well as a legal battle with enormous stakes for the rule of law in America. It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times Justice Department reporter Glenn Thrush is here. My friend and colleague, MSNBC senior political analyst and contributing host of Pod Save America, Alex Wagner, is here. And with me at the table, retired FBI agent, MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst Chris O'Leary is back. Glenn, take me through the reporting on what transpired this morning.
Well, if President Trump and his allies had intended to humiliate Jim Comey and humble him, it didn't work out the way that they had expected. Essentially what happened is Comey came into court with Patrick Fitzgerald, his attorney. He's not just any attorney. Patrick Fitzgerald is one of the most storied ex-prosecutors in the history of the Justice Department. He's brought and won major terrorism and public corruption cases. And at the defendant's table was Lindsay Halligan and these 2 fellas that got brought in yesterday from North Carolina. And the dynamic was extraordinary. If you were uninitiated and didn't have a roster to look at, you would think that the defense was the prosecution and the prosecution was the defense. You had, at one table, you had Comey, who is not only the FBI director. People forget that he also ran SDNY, the most powerful office in the Department of Justice. Against these 2 guys who've been in the department for less than 5 years each, and Halligan, who did not, I think rather wisely, say a word in this hearing. So it was this very strange juxtaposition of of these two very confident and competent veteran Justice Department people against their inquisitors who had very little experience. And I want to just add one other thing. The judge in the case, while he didn't go out on a limb or express any personal opinions on stuff, seemed extraordinarily skeptical of the government's effort and indicated that he didn't want to see the Justice Department drag this thing out in order to keep the cloud over Comey. He indicated, for instance, when the government wanted to introduce classified evidence, he said, why? This doesn't seem like it's that complicated a case. And he said, I'm going to deal with these issues as fast as you have ever seen. So one gets the sense that the judge, who is a Biden appointee, shares the general sense that he wants to move this along and some larger skepticism about the validity of the case.
Glenn, do we know what, I mean, Comey's lawyers indicated that he doesn't know anything more than we do about the indictment. What was Jim Comey indicted for doing?
He was indicted for allegedly lying during testimony with Ted Cruz before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The question concerned whether or not he had a cutout, an official in his orbit who was leaking stuff to reporters. Comey had claimed in that interaction that he had not ordered his subordinate to do that. And the second charge is really just iterative of the first charge. It's really just that one charge. They both carry 5 years potentially in prison. Even if convicted, he'd be very unlikely to see that, and it would be only one of those charges.
What is the next opportunity to adjudicate the plan that Pat Fitzgerald telegraphed today, which is to question the legality of Halligan's appointment? Well, the judge,
Nachmanoff, I didn't want to say Rachmaninoff, who I really like as a musician.
I think it's Nachmanoff,
I've been trying to train
right?
myself all afternoon. Yeah, that's right. Nachmanoff, sorry.
There you go.
Set out a general roadmap. He said he will, in his court, and we're going to start by the end of the month to have discovery, which means a roadmap for what evidence the department is going to hand over to Fitzgerald and Comey, but also motions by the end of the month to put together these motions that he was talking about. So the judge said that he will hear the motions about the vindictive and selective prosecution himself, but then, interestingly, he said he would outsource to someone else in the Fourth Circuit this question of whether or not Halligan was legally appointed. So what has now been created already are these two separate legal pathways to determine both of these claims that Fitzgerald and Comey have made.
What are the prospects that, if this proceeds, John Durham and Bill Barr are called as witnesses, who have both been on the record and written about, Barr in his book and Durham in his report, the lack of evidence to bring a criminal case against Jim Comey?
There's a lot of people that can be deposed in this case, including Eric Siebert, the former U.S. attorney, who was kicked out by Trump. Essentially, he was forced to resign. My reporting showed that when he was asked if he would bring some of these cases and said no, and then told he was going to see the door, he said that quitting was, quote, the easiest thing he had ever done. Subsequently to that, two of Siebert's top deputies, really, really respected people in that office, were canned for no reason other than the typical citing of Article 2 in presidential authority. All of these people could theoretically be brought to show their process product, including declination memos that were apparently written by one or more people, explaining why these things should not have been brought in the first place. And then the other question, which is a broader question, is making this case about the president ordering up this prosecution. I was talking with some attorneys today and also some other reporters who've covered this beat for a really long time. And, they were bringing up, do you have to subpoena the president? Do you have to subpoena people close to the president? And Nicole, as you said at the top of the hour, you don't. The stuff's out there. You basically have to you basically have to cut and paste URLs. The President of the United States made his intentions known. And in addition to that, in addition to putting out that extraordinary Saturday night, it was either a direct message or a Truth Social or both, essentially calling on Pam Bondi to go after these people. He then told reporters a couple of days later that he wanted to see Siebert out of there. So the president's own public statements and posts are likely going to be playing a very significant role in this without having to subpoena senior administration officials.
Well, and to your point about Pat Fitzgerald, he interviewed a president and a vice president in the course of the Valerie Plame investigation. I worked for both of them. So in terms of the teams, the way they've lined up, you could imagine if that is part of the case, you've got someone there that has done that before. And that would just be a remarkable. I mean, there's no privilege to what you posted on social media. To your point, why wouldn't he depose Donald Trump?
I don't know how far up the road this needs to get. I mean, if the judge is convinced by the public evidence, he may not need to go that far. And the point that you made about, we'll see how the Halligan thing plays out. I've heard mixed things on that, but if that invalidates the grand jury indictment, that's another whole ball game altogether. The one thing I would push back on is, I don't think that would necessarily. Again, I might be ignorant of the laws of criminal procedure here a little bit, but because I don't think it's double jeopardy to bring it to the grand jury twice. But I think the White House would push for whatever they could do to revive this if this was thrown out on some sort of a technicality. But I think your other guests might know a little bit more about that than I do.